Hi everyone, my name is Astri Setyarini and I'm here to present you my research. The title is Shamanism as a Resistance of Colonial Communities in Lejak, 1935 and Bontotan, 1937.
As we know, shamans and shamanism are an inseparable part of the culture of the Nusantara community. The existence of shamans and shamanism can not only be found in daily life, but also in literature. Literary works that contain the issue of shamanism are not only found in the modern era, but also the era of pre-independence, as in Chinese Malay literary works. Examples of these works that raise the issue of shamanism are Lejak, 1935 by Piet, and Bontotan, 1937 by Liem Khing Hoo. In these works, the role of the shaman is divided into two categories, namely the black magic shaman and the healer shaman. The shaman's background in both works comes from Pribumi and Chinese Peranakan groups. For example, Bontotan presented healer shaman from Pribumi background. Meanwhile, Lejak presented two types of shamans, such as healer shaman from Chinese background and black magic shaman from Pribumi background. The existence of these two types of shaman is supported by the community's great trust in the power possessed by both sides. The presence of these two works is unique, considering the practice of shamanism has been denied by colonialism because it is considered shameful, primitive, and backward. The reason is the practice of shamanism originated from belief and superstition, two things that are considered irrational and contrary to Western rationality upheld by the colonial government. Thus, the presence of Lejak and Bontotan is indicated as a form of resistance from the irrationalists who practice shamanism in both texts, namely the Pribumi and Chinese Peranakan group, against Western rationality. These conditions leads to two questions: how shamanistic practices became a form of resistance to the discourse of Western rationality shown by Lejak and Bontotan, and how the contestation between popular literary works as seen on Lejak and Bontotan and other literature which controlled by the colonial, such as Balai Pustaka's literature from the same period. The shamanistic practice presented in Lejak and Bontotan have several patterns, such as 1. Characteristic pattern, such as symbols and behavior. 2. Reciprocal relations between the shaman and the community in both works. 3. The pattern of people's behavior in dealing with things that are superstitious. 4. The use of religious elements in the practice of shamanism, especially in the practice of healer shaman. 5. The victory of the healer shaman with good moral compass. The 5 patterns show a common trait, namely belief in shamans and the practice of shamanism involving elements of spiritualism, especially Eastern spiritualism. These elements include belief in transcendent matters, such as supernatural beings, and the concept of divinity in religions, focuses on humanist aspects, such as the relationships between humans and the natural environment, including the world of spirits, and is guided by morals. Spiritualism lives in the practice of people's life and is considered to bring harmony to that life, so that its presence continues. This condition is certainly different from Western rationality, which originates from the results of a scientific-based thinking framework, theoretical, and emphasizes reasonability. Thus, the presence of Lejak and Bontotan implicitly also shows the contradiction between Eastern spirituality and Western rationality. The contradiction between the West and the East discourse also appears in the quotations in both texts. In both texts, it is stated that people's belief in superstition in the form of supernatural beings and shamanic practices is contrary to Western thinking. For example, in Bontotan, you can find the following quotations. Meanwhile, in Lejak, you can find the following quotations. Based on these two quotations, it appears that Bontotan is more explicit in voicing the differences in thinking between the West and the East regarding beliefs about superstitions. Meanwhile, Lejak voices this difference implicitly, namely placing Balinese people that left behind by Western modernity with a strong belief in religion and the occult. If using the concept of resistance by James Scott, the existence of shamanistic practices, and people's belief in the occult, which leads to their belief in shamans in both worlds, are forms of hidden resistance. Hidden resistance presented in both inside and outside Lejak and Bontotan. Inside the world, hidden resistance is presented in three forms, namely, outside the world, hidden resistance is also presented in three forms, namely, aspects outside the words are closely related to the positions of these two words in the Indonesian literary map in the colonial era. In the colonial era, Chinese Malay literature, which used Low Malay and generally had a popular literary genres, was considered lower-class literature. Its presence was favored by the second class of society, namely the Chinese group and Pribumi, but was disliked by the colonial government. At that time, the colonial government was campaigning for noble literature using High Malay, or the forerunner of today's Indonesian language, produced by Balai Pustaka, the publisher under the colonial guidance. Therefore, the existence of Chinese Malay literature, especially those that aggressively voices the realities of community life at the time, tend to be marginalized, even eradicated by the colonial government.
The practices of shamanism in both texts is a resistance that is manifested in small-scale movements, while at the same time showing the power of Eastern spirituality that contrasts with Western rationality. The contestation between popular literature and other literature, which controlled by the colonial on the same periods, shows that popular literature tends to be marginalized and there are attempts to eradicate its existence. Meanwhile, literary works, which controlled by the colonial, were placed as superior literature and became milestones for the development of Indonesian literature.